The sun rose lazily over our suburban enclave, casting soft light on manicured lawns and identical mailboxes. This neighborhood was serene, almost soporific, like a painting left to fade in the sun. But beneath the surface, it simmered with quiet tensions. The kind only a homeowners association like ours could cultivate. Karen was the self-appointed monarch of this kingdom. Her rule was law, her decrees absolute. She reigned over us from her home at the cul-de-sac's end, a fortress of scrutiny and florid garden gnomes, each one a sentry in her unyielding court. It began with the music, a few notes here and there, drifting on the breeze from my backyard, an acoustic guitar's gentle strum, a melody that mingled with birdsong and the rustle of leaves. Harmless, or so I thought, but for Karen, it was an affront, an invasion of noise in her perfectly orchestrated silence. Her notes arrived promptly at my doorstep, neat and precise, like her clipped handwriting. "Inconsiderate," she wrote, "disturbing the peace." And then, "HOA regulations strictly prohibit disturbances." I could almost see her red pen, underlining the rules with vigorous satisfaction. I folded her notes carefully, like origami, and set them aside. A collection of her little grievances, each one a testament to her steadfast dedication to order. I could have fought back, could have written my own notes or staged a musical protest. But I chose another path, one of quiet patience, of gentle defiance. I imagined Karen watching from her window, eyes sharp and calculating. Her presence was a shadow that stretched across the neighborhood, a persistent reminder of her vigilance. But I had my own shadow, one that danced with the flickers of mischief she couldn't quite catch. Instead of music, I let the neighborhood hum with its own life. Children's laughter, the rumble of distant lawnmowers, the coo of mourning doves. It was a symphony that played right under her watchful eye, slipping through the cracks in her armor of silence. I pondered what it meant to live in such a place, where every blade of grass was measured, every sound catalogued, where individual notes were discordant with the symphony of conformity. It was a dance of irony, this place of supposed tranquility, as we tiptoed around Karen's rules like performers in a delicate ballet. Then, an idea took root, quietly at first, like a seed in fertile ground. What if I let her own words echo back to her? What if the rules she so adored became a melody of their own? The thought was almost poetic, a twist of fate, an ironic cadence. I smiled at the notion, a slow, creeping grin that felt like sunrise after a long night. Karen might control the present, but the future was a melody, waiting to be written. I could orchestrate harmony from discord, crafting a symphony from the very regulations she wielded like a conductor's baton. As I pondered the possibilities, the neighborhood continued its gentle murmur. Life went on, undeterred by the watchful eyes at the end of the cul-de-sac, and in that quiet defiance, I found my own rhythm, a beat she couldn't silence, a harmony she couldn't stifle. I was patient. I would wait. Because sometimes the sweetest music is found not in sound, but in the anticipation of what is to come. The sun rose on another day in our little neighborhood, casting long shadows over manicured lawns and immaculately pruned hedges. The silence was almost deafening, a heavy blanket that smothered any hint of life. But beneath that quiet surface, tension simmered like a pot left too long on the stove. Karen, with her clipboard and severe gaze, was at it again. She prowled the sidewalks like a predator, her eyes scanning for any infractions, real or imagined. Grass half an inch too tall, a garbage can visible from the street, a car parked slightly askew. Each was a transgression that sparked her righteous fury. She was the self-appointed guardian of conformity, a sentinel against chaos. The absurdity of it all was almost poetic. An HOA meeting was scheduled for that evening, and I had my permit ready. I would finally give voice to her tyranny, amplifying her declarations for all to hear. It was a small victory, but one that felt like a drop of rain in a desert. As the day wore on, whispers began to swirl like leaves caught in a gust. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, wary of Karen's omnipresent influence. Word had gotten out about my plan, though I had shared it with only a trusted few. The air was electric with anticipation. and the neighborhood felt alive in a way it hadn't for a long time. Then came the citations, slipped under doors or handed out with a clipped nod. I received mine around noon, a notice about my hedges, which were accused of being unruly. I allowed myself a wry smile. It was almost impressive how Karen could find fault where none existed. Her creativity in finding issues was rivaled only by her lack of empathy. The absurdity of the situation made me laugh, a bitter sound that echoed in the confines of my home. I kept thinking of the permit, my silent rebellion against a regime of pettiness. The idea of her voice blaring across the neighborhood, her own words used against her, was intoxicating. As evening descended, the sky painted in hues of orange and purple, I set up my speakers with meticulous care. A few neighbors gathered, drawn by curiosity. Their eyes held a mix of hope and trepidation, like spectators at a circus, uncertain whether to expect a spectacular show or a calamitous disaster. The meeting began with the usual formalities. Karen's voice, clipped and precise, filled the room. Her words were a familiar litany of rules and restrictions, a symphony of control. I listened with bated breath, waiting for the perfect moment. When she reached the topic of noise regulations, the irony was too rich to ignore. I pressed play, and her voice boomed across the lawns, echoing off the walls. It was surreal, hearing her dictate the silence in a voice that shattered it. For a moment, there was stunned silence. Then came the murmurs, the ripples of realization spreading through the crowd. Karen's face turned a remarkable shade of crimson. She was caught in her own web, ensnared by the very rules she cherished. And as her voice continued to echo, a strange thing happened. Laughter, soft and hesitant at first, began to fill the spaces between her words. It grew, a wave of shared understanding and defiance. The neighborhood, usually so subdued, was alive with the sound of rebellion. In that moment, I realized something profound. Her power was an illusion, a fragile construct that crumbled under scrutiny. The permit was more than a piece of paper. It was a statement, a declaration that we would not be silenced. The silence was broken, and in its place, we found our voice. The sun, defiant in its descent, cast long shadows over the quaint cul-de-sac, reminding me of the days when music would drift freely through the air, unhindered by misguided authority. Now, silence reigned, punctuated only by the low hum of suburban monotony. But in this quiet, rebellion brewed. I documented every absurdity, each petty decree, as if collecting the mismatched pieces of an intricate puzzle. The HOA's edicts were etched in my mind, a tapestry of control masquerading as community concern. But the heart of it was Karen, the self-appointed arbiter of taste and tranquility. Her disdain for spontaneity was rivaled only by her penchant for rules. My plan was simple, a counter so subtle it would echo through the neighborhood long after the echoes of laughter and song had been silenced. I cradled the permit like a talisman, a small slip of paper that would turn the tables in a way Karen couldn't foresee. It was official, undeniable, a beacon of irony that shone brilliantly against the rigid backdrop of conformity. The first broadcast was scheduled for the following weekend. In the days leading up, I walked through the neighborhood, observing the restless energy barely contained beneath the surface. Neighbors tended to their lawns with the precision of artists crafting a masterpiece, their eyes averted, trapped in the unspoken agreement of compliance. On the day, I set up the speakers with meticulous care, each cable and connection a silent promise of retribution. The equipment stood resolute on my lawn, a sentinel of impending change. As the time approached, I felt the anticipation thrumming in the air, a tangible force that set my heart racing. When the appointed hour arrived, I flipped the switch. Voices, once confined to sterile meeting rooms, now spilled forth with a clarity that was almost poetic. The discussions, usually whispered in the shadows, were laid bare for all to hear. There was a strange beauty in the mundane logistics of neighborhood paint palettes and fence heights being amplified for the world. The irony was delicious. The residents emerged slowly from their homes, drawn to the unexpected melody of bureaucracy. They lingered at the edges of their driveways, curiosity peaked as the usual veneer of HOA decorum cracked ever so slightly. I watched their faces, a symphony of surprise and amusement as they realized the power of their collective voice. Karen was not amused. Her expression, framed by the neat hedges of her yard, was a portrait of disbelief and indignation. Her authority, so carefully constructed, now had a soundtrack. The broadcast continued, each word a note in a new composition of defiance. There was a certain satisfaction in knowing that Karen's words, meant to control, were now the very instrument of their undoing. A quiet rebellion, woven into the fabric of the neighborhood, resonated through the air. In that moment, I realized the power of subtlety, the beauty of letting the truth speak louder than any noise. The community was listening, awakening to the possibilities beyond the silence. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the last of its light across the listening faces, I knew this was just the beginning. The ambient hum of the outdoor lights at the clubhouse buzzed like a distant swarm of bees, barely audible beneath the whispers of dusk. The evening air, crisp with the promise of autumn, carried the scent of fallen leaves, a backdrop to the silence that had enveloped our neighborhood since the decree to snuff out all music. It was as if the heart of the community had been put on mute, leaving only the sound of distant cars on the highway, like waves breaking far from shore. They had insisted on silence. I, however, found a loophole, dark and twisted like the roots of the old oak near the community entrance. A permit that required no fanfare, just a quiet trip to City Hall and a small fee. It felt like a private joke shared with the universe, one that bloomed silently in the back of my mind, ready to unfold at the perfect moment. When the meetings began, they were somber affairs, the room filled with the usual suspects, the self-important board members whose faces wore expressions as tight as the knots in their neckties, and the residents, marionettes in an unending play. Their voices were hushed, respectful of an unspoken decorum. But now, thanks to the permit, their words would echo beyond the four walls, reaching every corner of the neighborhood. I set up the speakers with understated precision, their sleek forms blending into the background, unnoticed by those too absorbed in their routines to see the change in the air. As the meeting commenced, the speakers hummed to life, their presence a gentle but relentless tide. The board hadn't anticipated this. How could they? Their faces twisted in slow realization as their voices, their commands, and their petty decrees poured out into the night, carried on the crisp breeze like a song to the stars. The irony was delicious. They had silenced music, but now their own words, a symphony of arrogance and control, were broadcast for all to hear. The first night, it was chaos. Curtains twitched and blinds were drawn as neighbors peeked out from their sanctuaries, curiosity tugging at them in the darkness. I watched it unfold from my porch, a spectator to the unraveling, sipping tea under the watchful gaze of the moon. It was a quiet victory, one that warmed me more than the chamomile in my cup. Their voices, now amplified, were stripped of pretense. Every condescending remark, every dismissive gesture was laid bare, naked in the open air. The night was filled with the irony of their own making, and the neighborhood, once stifled, began to breathe again. In time, the board members shifted, their meetings a dance of restraint and forced politeness. The speakers became an unlikely ally, a guardian of transparency. The neighborhood, a peculiar audience to its own governance, began to change. Conversations flourished where silence once reigned, a community finding its voice in the unlikeliest of ways. And as the days turned to weeks, the speakers remained, a testament to the power of a quiet, legal rebellion. It wasn't the music of instruments, but it was music nonetheless. The melody of change, of unmasked truths, echoed through the streets, a symphony played on a stage of irony and defiance. The air felt different that morning, charged with an anticipatory energy. I stepped outside into the crisp dawn, the neighborhood still quiet, shadows softening the edges of the world. A subtle breeze whispered through the trees, rustling leaves that seemed to hold secrets of their own. It was the day of the monthly HOA meeting, now infamous for its melodramatic displays and Karen's iron grip. But today promised something different. I walked to the community center, the permit in my back pocket a comforting reminder of what was to come. It had taken weeks to get it, navigating bureaucratic mazes with patience and persistence, quietly undermining Karen's oppressive silence with legal precision. The power of paper, a simple permit, had shifted the scales. People gathered slowly, wearing expressions that ranged from weary resignation to quiet curiosity. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the pavement. I set up the speakers, the dull thud of my heart matching the rhythmic thrum of anticipation in my veins. Curious glances shot my way, but no words were exchanged. Karen arrived, punctual as always, her presence heralded by a stiff wind that seemed to carry her in like a storm. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the gathering crowd with an air of ownership. Part queen, part predator. She took her place at the head, her voice soon rising, attempting to command the audience with the usual litany of restrictions and rebukes. But today, her words met resistance. I flipped the switch. The speakers crackled to life. In an instant, her declarations were no longer contained within the walls of the community center, but broadcast to every home around us. The neighborhood, long muted under her rule, could finally hear her machinations in their raw, unguarded form. The effect was immediate. Windows opened, curtains fluttered. Neighbors stepped onto porches, drawn by the spectacle of their everyday lives laid bare, amplified for all to hear. It was a symphony of truth, each note a revelation, echoing across manicured lawns. Karen faltered, her composure cracking like porcelain under pressure. The mask slipped, and beneath it, a glimpse of panic, an unfamiliar emotion for her, flickered. For the first time, her power was not absolute. It was shared, dispersed among the very people she'd sought to control. The meeting continued, but the tone was different now. A shift in the air, like the first breath of spring after a long winter. Questions rose, voices once subdued now finding strength. People spoke of community, of unity, of reclaiming spaces that had felt more like cages than homes. Karen watched, her silence more telling than her words had ever been. There was no climactic confrontation, no explosive showdown, just a gradual unraveling, like a tightly wound spool finally given room to breathe. Karen's reign ended not with a bang, but with a collective whisper, a gentle reclaiming of power that resonated louder than any shout. As the meeting concluded, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. I packed up the speakers, feeling the weight of change settle comfortably on my shoulders. The community, restored to itself, dispersed with renewed purpose. Karen lingered, a solitary figure against the dying light, sidelined but not forgotten, a reminder of what was, and a silent witness to what would be. I walked home through the quiet streets, the echoes of the day's events lingering in the air. The power of silence, once a tool of oppression, had been transformed into one of liberation. And in that silence, a new story began to unfold, a story of community, of resilience, of hope.